Let me briefly talk to you about Angular's HTTP service and how we can make use of the HTTP service to communicate with a server. The Angular HTTP service is a core Angular service that enables you to communicate with a server by using the methods provided by the HTTP service. The HTTP service will enable you to initiate either an XML HTTP request or a JSON request to the server from your browser. So you can make use of this within your application in order to access a server and then maybe either get data from a server or put or post data to a server. So perform any kind of server-side operations. The HTTP request by nature is asynchronous, meaning that when you issue the request, you're not going to get the results immediately. So you need to wait for the result. Now, whenever you need to wait for the result, we make the use of the promise that Angular provides. Let's talk about that next. Promise is a service that Angular provides. It is a generic service that can be used whenever you need to perform operations asynchronously. So whenever you need to do any asynchronous operation, the return from initiating that asynchronous operation is a promise. The promise object is specifying to you that when the asynchronous operation is completed, it'll come back to tell you what happened. So it's like a promise. You are promising somebody that something is going to be either upheld or will not be upheld at some point in the future. So the promise object could be in one of three states. When the promise is initiated, it is in the pending state, meaning that the promise has not been resolved yet. When the promise gets resolved, meaning that the asynchronous work has completed, then the resulting state could be either fulfilled, meaning that the promise was satisfied and the work was done correctly, or the promise is rejected, meaning that whatever work, asynchronous work, was not completed correctly. So the promise object allows you to specify callbacks. These callbacks are specified as functions, typical JavaScript functions. So within these functions, you're going to let the promise know what it is supposed to do when the promise is returned. Depending on whether the promise ends up in the fulfilled state or the rejected state, you can have two different callbacks functions being executed. So one would be to identify one, we could call it as a success function, meaning that the promise was properly fulfilled. Then you would execute that function. So you can supply whatever code within that function, meaning that when the promise is completed, that code will be executed. Similarly, when the promise is rejected, the code in the rejected function or the error function would be executed on your behalf. So in this case, you are specifying two different functions. Within those functions, you're going to specify what is it that Angular is supposed to do if the promise is fulfilled or if the promise is rejected. So you're supplying two different pieces of code there. Which one gets executed depends on whether the promise actually gets fulfilled correctly or gets rejected. Now, with the HTTP service, that is exactly what we're going to leverage because communication with the server is asynchronous. And you have to wait for the response to come back from the server. As you saw when we studied about HTTP, an HTTP request sent to a server will result in a response coming back from the server. Not instantaneously, but after a period of time. We don't know what the response is going to be, whether the response says that whatever has to be done has been done correctly, or whether the response says that there was an error in completing the request. Either of the two cases, we need to handle the situation. This is what the HTTP service in Angular enables us to do. So the HTTP service will return a promise. How do you invoke an HTTP service? In general, you can say HTTP, and within braces, you can specify the method that you want it to execute. Remember the methods in HTTP: get, put, post, delete, head, and some others. So you can specify the method, and then you also need to specify the URL. Where is the server that you're going to access, and what is the resource there that you're going to try and access. And then after that, you would specify with a then clause, you would specify two functions. One function, which is the function that will be executed if the request is successfully fulfilled. The second function is the function that will be executed if the request results in an error on the server side. Now, if you look at some of the older documentation or some of the blog entries out there, you might see people using two methods associated with the HTTP called success and error, and each of them takes one function as a parameter. Now, Angular's recent documentation says that the success and error functions are deprecated in favor of using the then function. So I will persist in using the then function instead. So the then takes two functions. One is a success function, the other one is an error function here. We have shortcut methods to invoke specific HTTP methods. So you can call http.get, http.put, post, and so on. We will see an example in the next slide. In this example, I am invoking an HTTP GET request. So I specify the HTTP GET request as http.get, and I specify the URL in there. So it takes the URL as the parameter. You can specify additional parameters if required, but this is the minimum that you need to specify. Now, in addition to the HTTP GET, it will be followed with the chaining of the then method. The then method, as I mentioned, takes two functions there. So here I am specifying two functions. The first function is the success. The second function is the error function. So the first function will be executed if the request is successfully completed. The second function will be executed if the request fails to execute correctly. If it is successful, I am expecting the dishes object array to be returned by this GET request, and that will be assigned to the dishes object on the scope. If not, then the error message will be printed out by my Angular application. So I set this message variable to an error message string, and this I will put it onto my DOM to indicate that an error has occurred. We will see this in the exercise that follows next. The response coming in from the server is returned as a parameter to the functions, both the success function and the error function. So it comes in as a response object. This response object has several properties. Let's look at some of them that are useful for us. If we say response.data, that will return either the string or the object that is contained in the body of the response message. So if you do a GET request to the dishes collection on the server, then the return value will be in the form of a JSON object array, and that will be carried in the body of the message. So if I say response.data, I get access to the JSON object array that contains the information about all the dishes. I can also ask for the status code by checking the response.status. Headers config also can be checked. Even status text can be obtained by saying response.status text. Now, you have seen me in the earlier example using the response status and the response status text to construct the error message that will be displayed if the request results in an error on the server side. Let me briefly mention about the ngIf directive. The The ngIf directive is like the ng-show and the ng-hide directive. It allows us to show or hide a part of the DOM tree. Now, the ngIf directive is interesting in the sense that based on the expression that you give to the ngIf directive, the entire DOM tree will either be included or excluded completely from the DOM. The ng-show or the ng-hide directive did not remove that part of the DOM tree from the DOM. That still remained in the document. But in case of ngIf, if the expression that you give to the ngIf evaluates to false, then that particular part of the DOM tree will be removed completely from the remaining part of your document. So in this example, let's look at how we use the ngIf. So for the ngIf, I am giving the expression as not show menu, meaning that if show menu is equal to false, then the expression will evaluate to true, and then this particular div will be included in the DOM. If show menu is true, then the expression will evaluate to false, and in that case, this entire div will be removed from the DOM completely. It won't even be part of the DOM structure. So that's the use of the ngIf directive. With this brief understanding of the HTTP service, we will move to the next exercise, where we're going to use the HTTP service in order to communicate with the server and then download various pieces of information from the server. In addition, we'll also be including functions for doing error handling, as shown in the example that you saw earlier in this lecture.